Yeah.
Good to see you.
Okay.
Well, it's just a bit fun.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
But then-
All right. Yeah, nice to have you.
He said, "Oh, you didn't get the ticket." I think he did climb.
Yeah.
And then,
Yes.
you know,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think we had the, what do you call it, but she did, she got a pass, a season pass. Yeah. But she did.
She leave Friday?
Friday.
Kim and I didn't.
We're staying a week, huh?
So we.
Yeah. Wanted to go to.
No, I wasn't Delaware.
Right, not a lot of deep powder.
And Kim was
You know.
very good ice cream. It was very cold in New Jersey where he lived, beautiful ice skater. But he didn't.
I convinced her. Never, we
Yeah.
lived in New York.
So we could go up.
Specific stock.
Go down to beginner.
Spring break. and sort of.
Yeah.
Better and better.
Yeah, yeah. I think they had some.
So,
But not many.
We'll just stay in Manhattan for a few days.
But
We
you just
never do
keep
those
staying.
things.
Yeah.
Pretty good.
Are you pretty good?
Then I come back.
Yeah.
My father's, my mother grew up only occasionally. Memorial.
I know, it's
Not that far.
it's easier to get to.
Yeah.
Spring. I mean,
That's a short one this time.
I know. Tell you that after. Of your own grandson, reading it.
yeah. Yeah.
I think his grandmother knows.
My kids really don't like.
He didn't know what it was, but they. Oh, one picture.
I mean, I lived
I know
there for
it.
summer.
I know it did well, but
It's changed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very. Well, here we are.
Yeah.
Oh.
realize it was so it's like whole neighborhood. I said, you could do that.
You never know.
There's only one garden.
I know.
A lot of more.
It's very. Final.
Recognize the lady.
Good morning. You guys able to hear us? Who tuned in virtually?
Yep.
All right, good. How's that one working? Can you hear anything coming out of that speaker?
Noise, little
Yeah.
leaking things.
All right.
Why is there a picture of the line? Is that you?
No, that's someone. That's someone's video.
I don't know.
Here we go. I could, let's see.
Change it.
There we go. I turned it off.
Well, look at that.
I don't know it.
I might not be able to reverse it, but I can do it once.
All right, we'll do one. I just want to make sure you see ours. I
Yeah.
just pop in there.
And- So.
Morning, Connor. How's it going?
Hi, what's up? How are you?
Good.
Yeah.
Whatever you want.
For these assignments.
Well, usually it's the task force, but some of them are off island and some are tuning in.
Oh,
They offered him the job.
but he,
He didn't want it because so many, because two generations people had. And
I didn't, I don't think I did.
yes,
Figure out your job.
I did, yeah, I went over to Goodell's, they hooked it right up.
he said it would be
Yeah. One of the.
Starting this and pulling them around.
Yeah, started one.
having. a-
Dan. Dan.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
So he chose not to, but yes, he was a very good archaeologist. He is a very good archaeologist.
I think my book is the history of Seneca, as far as the lovely Walter Silver.
Why don't you just announce, make sure everybody.
Yeah, I'm gonna get it.
I think the name was Percy Burton, very nice to look at. They're only five earlier superintendent.
Oh.
Well, I mean it to one of Walter, yes.
Silva, yeah.
Yeah.
I see her where it's stopping. Try this.
I know, she's excited. I know. It's like, what?
No, I gotta see maybe my reminder.
Or just next one. Thank you. One, Tom.
So,
Well, how are you going to know?
oh,
Good.
yourself.
Everywhere. Yeah. You got the short ear hours.
You been traveling or you been?
I've been here.
Oh, you told me you were going.
It's on my, he fails the door and close my regulation.
No, Mark. Listen, that's my world.
I'm just about ready to listen in on this meeting, which is
I'm
video
going
from a
next.
video.
Oh, wonderful. So she went home for 3 weeks. I have kids in school.
Yep.
Somebody has to stay back.
Right.
So, you got to New York?
It worked out.
The city daughter, yeah. Who's city daughter? So are you gonna get?
Oh, okay.
Where you
We got a camp up in Maine
Oh, nice.
and, they're getting some blood down there.
Yeah.
Is CCR here?
From Nature Conservancy?
They are.
She's, yeah. Right before we start, is everybody participating signed up on the sign-in sheet,
Going around, I think.
passing around, and if we can provide information or anything else for them? This is
All right. Welcome, everyone. This is our March 12th Correllus Task Force meeting. We have our DCR partners with us, attending virtually. We also have Assistant Director from Natural Heritage Program, Jesse Leddick, with us. Their Senior Restoration Ecologist, Chris Bulow. And I will thanks for joining us, everyone. And I will, let DCR have a chance to introduce their team before we go much further. AJ, you want to
Sure.
take charge of that?
Sure. Thanks, Dan. And we got some Hollywood squares here, so I'm going to do my best. But good morning, everyone. AJ Tarigny, Policy and Public Affairs, DCR. Paul?
Paul Gregory, Southeast Management Forester for DCR.
Chief?
Hey, good morning, everybody. Dave Salino. I'm the Chief Fire Warden for DCR.
Thanks, Chief. Bill?
Bill Van Dorn. I work as a forest biometrician for the Division of State Parks and Recreation.
Great. And I believe Paul, is Tom on? I'm trying to see
Yep.
if he's
I'm Tom Brule, the Forest Management Program Supervisor for DCR.
perfect. Thanks, Tom. And I believe there's two of our fire wardens in the room as well. Dan?
We've got our district fire warden, Josh Nigro, and our state forest superintendent, Connor Laffey, with us.
Perfect. Thanks,
as well.
Connor.
And, for us in the room, if your screen is off, we don't know you're there, except if you're, sitting on my lap here. So just for the other task force members in the room, just to make sure, we have Jeremy Hauser from BCS, Karen Lombard from the Nature Conservancy, Luann Johnson from Biodiversity Works, and that is who I see at the moment.
Did anybody introduce Chris Bulow? Maybe I missed that.
I did, but Chris, welcome again.
Hey everyone, Chris Bulow, Senior Restoration Ecologist for the Mass Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program.
Great, and I also see Karen Calgel from, the prescribed fire manager from MassWildlife as well.
Hi, folks.
Good to have you all.
And from the task force, Tom Chase is here.
That's right. We also have Tom Chase in the room. We have Chris Seidel as well, and we have Adam Turner next to me.
Commission member yet.
And I think I covered everyone on the task force who's attending remotely.
Now we know who's.
Very good. All right, so we dedicated did you have anything else you want to add before we go into the presentation?
Presentation from DCR is what everybody came to see.
The agenda largely speaks for itself. We're going to have a presentation on the plantation removal and restoration project, and I can turn it over to DCR from here. Paul, should I give you the controls for screen sharing?
Yes.
Okay. There you go.
Okay.
If anyone in the back row or otherwise can't hear very well,
We also have two screens.
let us know. We can turn it up. But yeah, it is in both directions. The slide, the visuals. And we also have Chief Shaper who just joined us in the room. Paul, for some reason, we're only seeing
Okay, give me a second.
all right, most of your screen, but a little bit's cut off. No rush.
Chief, good morning. Good morning. Now we have the other side.
How's that? No?
Bingo.
Okay. Just want to make sure. Okay, and also if the slides don't advance, just let me know.
All right, that's great. And we'll save we'll save our questions, the working group's questions until the end. And, as everyone's seen on the agenda, we'll go to public comment from there. So we'll let you get through this start to finish, Paul.
Okay, sounds good. So welcome everybody. I'm here to provide insight into a required restoration project for the Manuel Correllus State Forest aimed at removing a portion of the conifer plantations to facilitate the establishment of native shrublands and woodlands for rare species. I'll start with a little bit of a background of Manuel Correllus State Forest. The forest is approximately 5,200 acres. And it's made up of what are called sandplain ecosystems. These globally rare natural communities include heathlands, scrub oak shrublands, and oak woodlands. Sandplain communities support numerous rare plants and animal species that are listed as endangered, threatened, or of special concern and protected under the state's Endangered Species Act. The state purchased 612 acres in 1908 to attempt to protect habitat for the heath hen, a subspecies of the greater prairie chicken, which has drastically declined. Unfortunately, it wasn't successful as the heath hen went extinct in 1932, Leading causes to extinction were related to habitat fragmentation and loss throughout its range, human interference, and random natural events. DCR is proposing to remove a portion of the existing plantations in the state forest. This is required under the conditions of a 2001 Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program conservation permit for expanding fire breaks due to the high risk of wildfires. The expansion of the fire breaks resulted in the loss of habitat for state-listed species. To mitigate this habitat loss, DCR and MassWildlife worked collaboratively to develop a mitigation plan that included removing and restoring 216 acres of conifer plantations to restore to native natural communities. Natural Heritage issued an amended permit in 2001, requiring DCR to fulfill the requirements of the 2001 permit and provide additional mitigation for new trails constructed in the forest. We received credit under this permit for removing dead and dying red pine plantations for previous work in the state forest. The public process for this project began in 2022 and then was postponed during the forestry pause as DCR waited the recommendations from the Forests as Climate Solutions Initiative and the Climate Forestry Committee. It was evaluated under these recommendations and found to be in alignment as this project converts the plantation into a more compositionally diverse forest through harvesting and aligns with many climate-smart forestry practices. Our primary goal is to remove white pine plantations to restore and maintain native oak woodlands and scrub oak shrublands. Secondary goals are to reduce the risk of wildfires, protect public safety, and provide safe access for firefighters and fire apparatus. The local fire chiefs are concerned with the high risk for wildfires in the forest. The current drought we are in shows how susceptible Massachusetts forests are to wildfires. Occasional prescribed burning or mowing will keep fuel loads and crown densities low, thereby making wildfires much easier to control. Prescribed burning can be used long-term to maintain open woodlands. Due to their unique environmental conditions and connection to fire, Barrens communities are associated with many state-listed and other rare species, with a few shown here. About 40% of the land-based species listed by the Massachusetts Endangered Species Act are found in fire-influenced ecosystems, with the majority of them being solely dependent upon barrens and related natural communities. Barren species include, among others, whippoorwill, northern harrier, New England blazing star, and a suite of highly rare butterflies and moths. Manuel Correllus State Forest is one of our most important properties for rare species in Massachusetts, with 34 state-listed species. Active habitat management is required to maintain the biodiversity of these barren communities. These disturbance-dependent natural communities have evolved to positively respond to temporary disturbance. DCR and MassWildlife's work across the Commonwealth has repeatedly shown this to be true. DCR and MassWildlife have worked together in other areas. One example is taking place in Miles Standish State Forest and the surrounding wildlife management areas. Prescribed fire would be one form of management that would likely take place to help restore the landscape and make it well suited for fire-dependent species. This would help expose buried seeds of more specialist rare plants, thus promoting germination, and will reduce the seed source of the plantations that spread beyond their footprint. Many of these natural communities we hope to restore are collectively referred to as barren communities or pine barrens. Barrens, habitat of which most of the state forest is comprised, cannot occur just anywhere. These natural communities are globally rare, fire-dependent, shrub-dominated communities with scattered trees and occasional openings, occurring on dry, nutrient-poor, usually sandy soils. As mentioned, they provide habitat for many state-listed rare species. Excluding disturbance, as through fire, enables the encroachment of generalist species which in turn does not support the rare wildlife species presently using the forest. The plantations are limiting the biodiversity of the state forest. The earliest plantation was established in 1914. Tree planting continued until 1990, with most plantations being established between 1925 and 1932. Red pine, white pine, Scots pine, and white spruce were the main species planted. The plantations range from heavily stocked closed canopy to sparsely stocked with open canopy, where either past treatment, salvage, thinning, and shelter wood, or insects and diseases have occurred. The orange hatching represents the entire 175-acre project. The 2 units, A and B, with teal outlines are the initial 79 acres. These units were first chosen due to their high density monoculture of white pine and proximity to residential housing. For this plantation removal project, DCR has worked with the task force to initially focus on 4 3-acre openings in Plantation A, an overstory removal of white pine, leaving the existing oak trees in Plantation B. This approach will help educate DCR and the task force to determine cost estimates for the larger plantations as a whole and provide adaptive management practices for future phases. The project will also allow connectivity from the Pohoganut Tract all the way up the eastern side of the state forest. With climate change in the minds of everyone, this project will increase the resiliency of the state forest to future climate variability, as it will restore a diversity of native tree and understory plant species that is lacking in most of the plantations. While management for climate change is important, biodiversity is equally important, as it is a major component of both resiliency and the adaptive capacity of a forested ecosystem to climate change. We can balance out carbon considerations and habitat restoration for state-listed species. DCR and MassWildlife are strategic in where these types of projects can occur. DCR alone manages more than 450,000 acres across the state, and we will still be able to meet our carbon sequestration goals, even with the removal of these plantations. Additionally, it would be irresponsible from an ecological perspective and dangerous from a public safety perspective to manage exclusively for accruing carbon. There will be a carbon release when trees are cut and when prescribed fire is used to restore and maintain natural communities. A single wildfire, however, could release virtually all of the carbon currently stored in the live plant tissue. Managing this fire-adapted ecosystem will release carbon in measured, controlled, and relatively low amounts that will be resequestered during the intervals between prescribed burns and will provide a critical safeguard against large wildfires. White pines do have an ecological role in the island landscape, but not at the density found in the plantations and not in this location. Trees are not the only carbon sink in open habitats. The ground floor can sequester much carbon below ground, and low intensity fires generate a lot of black carbon, otherwise known as biochar. This is inert and resides in the soil pool for thousands of years. The next few slides provide examples of the references used to put together this project. The draft Manuel Correllus State Forest Fire Management Plan recommends removing all remaining plantations and using prescribed burns on logged areas to suppress white pine regeneration and facilitate habitat restoration. Even though Manuel Correllus State Forest has been designated as a reserve, management for reducing the risk of wildfire and for rare species habitat is allowed, specifically calling out reserves in the southeast for management. Also, removing plantations is specifically called out as an exception and as an exception in the guidelines for reserves, and this project has been reviewed by the Forest Reserve Science Advisory Committee. To develop recommendations for climate-oriented forest management guidelines, EA Secretary Tepper appointed a 12-member group of scientific experts who were convened as the Climate Forestry Committee. This project does not run counter to the recommendations of the Commonwealth's Climate Solutions Act and the Climate Forestry Committee. There was consensus on the committee that plantations should be converted to more compositionally diverse forests via harvest. Conversions of plantations align with many climate-smart forestry practices highlighted in the Climate Forestry Committee's report, such as improving resistance to pests and pathogens, increasing resiliency by promoting diversity of plant species, providing age-class structural diversity, improving conditions for a wide variety of local wildlife through the creation of temporary young forest habitat, and promoting future adapted tree species in the regeneration mix. Having followed our procedures of writing a forest management proposal, holding a public meeting and comment period, writing a silvicultural prescription, and having an on-site pre-harvest walk, the next step in the process would be to file a forest cutting plan. This is an official state document that gets sent to the local Conservation Commission for comment and to the state service forester for approval per state regulations. A copy gets sent to the select board as a courtesy. The service forester will send it to the Massachusetts Natural Heritage Endangered Species Program for their review. For these types of projects, natural heritage often requires certain conditions to avoid and minimize impacts to state listed species, such as a time restriction on when mechanical operations can occur, and best management practices to avoid introducing or spreading invasive species. Here are some details of the project. The project will be done in the off-season from November to April. Typically, it'll be as the general time. Natural heritage might have a more sensitive time for us to proceed. We plan on concentrating on Plantation A and portions of Plantation B, breaking it up in phases to supply local sawmills raw material in coordination with the Martha's Vineyard Commission and others. In order to ensure the safety of public, areas of the state forest will be closed to the public during active operations. The method to remove the white pines will be whole tree harvesting. We'll be leaving a buffer between Edgartown, West Tisby Road, and the paved bike path. The landscape view will change from a single species forest monoculture to a more diverse and native shrubland or oak woodland community. We will be using a state contract of pre-approved vendors. We will send out a request for quotes, having an on-site bidders meeting. All machine operators will be licensed timber harvesters, and DCR staff will be on site throughout the project to oversee the progress. These are examples of the type of equipment used in the past for similar mechanical operations. Trees will be cut and bundled by the feller buncher, then transported to the landing by the skidder. At the landing, material will be processed into either saw logs or chips. Forest products will be distributed locally where possible, and no wood products will be left behind at the state forest. For continued management of the forest, the DCR For continued management of the forest, DCR and the commission, For management of the forest, DCR, Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket team includes one full-time operational team leader, 3 seasonal staff, 2 summer and 1 winter, and additional support from mainland rangers. DCR Forest Fire Control also has 1 full-time firefighter assigned to assist on the island, augmented by fire staff from the mainland when needed. Finally, DCR has been approved to add an additional full-time park operations position to the forest, which is currently posted. Recent investments in machinery have supported ongoing operations, including mowing and prescribed fire. That concludes my presentation, and we can take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Paul. Before I go to my local counterparts here or on the screen. Is there anyone from your office that would like to add anything, or anyone at MassWildlife? Just wanted to give you the opportunity, give you the floor before we turn the discussion to the team members here. Okay.
I think we'll just dive in.
Just dive in. Very good. All right. Correllus Group. Any questions for Paul or comments?
I have a question. I'm curious to know, are you just gonna?
Just give us a second. We're gonna get to the public comment.
All right.
That's toward the end of the meeting. Well, I have some, but I was gonna try to withhold and restrain myself. Give others the chance first.
Okay, Dan.
Go ahead, Jeremy.
Not so much a question, it's just a call for a little bit to expand a little bit on what the thoughts are for how the work would progress in this early going. There was a brief mention of beginning with, I believe it was creating 3-acre patches, and then a quick transition over to what would happen in area B versus area A. And as I was scribbling down my notes here, those things just got a bit mixed up. So I was just hoping we could maybe return to that section and just take it a little slower.
Sure. Plantation A is a 32-acre plantation, and it is very dense with white pine, nearly nothing else growing. And we would put in 4 3-acre patch cuts in that plantation. Plantation B has a lot more understory shrubs and ground cover and oak trees. And in plantation B, we would remove the white pine, leaving the oak and the scrub oak, blueberry, huckleberry, and so forth.
Great, thanks. That helps a bunch. So I think then seems fairly clear that the 3-acre patch cuts in area A is really about targeting. These are probably going to be patches that are almost exclusively white pine.
Correct.
Okay.
Or they'll be set back from the roads just to minimize any invasives coming in, and they're really more of an experiment or a research plot to see what happens in these monocultures. Really, that's what. Yeah.
Thank you. That's great.
We're gonna turn to that. We'll get there. Promise. Tom.
Yeah, Paul, Tom Chase here. What's the span of time between doing the 3-acre patch cuts and then moving it up to the larger process?
Well, currently it would be done at the same time to save costs. I mean, if we had to do it, separately, obviously it would be more expensive coming back twice and leaving. But we hope to do it the 4 3-acre patch cuts and the overstory removal on plantation B at the same time. I mean, the 4-acre patch cuts won't take very long at all to put in.
Thanks.
Well, what sort of findings, and I don't know, maybe this is better suited for Connor. What have you found on the heels of the red pine removal? Where some restoration attempts have been made already in recent, I guess it's not too recent. I think it was 10, 15 years ago, but still fairly recent. What's returned?
Right. Once the red pine was removed, the scrub oak really took over. The the oaks, started coming in as well. I mean, it's been really, you wouldn't even know they were there, really. It's been quite an amazing turnaround.
Anything you want to add, Connor?
Oh, yeah, I mean, in those areas that were harvested, the only signs of the red pine in there now are that if you were to find the stumps themselves. Other than that, it looks pretty similar to other sections of the forest, a lot of scrub oak and tree oaks and fish pine in there. In some of those areas, it's still pretty dense. The prescribed fire would be beneficial. But we also have been maintaining them now that we have a mulching head on a mini excavator as well. And a lot of that is to be able to open up those areas for future prescribed fires as well.
All right. Anyone else from the team? Any questions?
One more, I suppose. How often do you expect, or what would be the interval between burning a particular restoration area? Like how often will you need to repeat fire?
I would say typically it'd be anywhere from 5 to 10 years.
Thanks.
You got into this a little bit, but maybe this question is better suited for Jesse or Chris. But why here? Why are the stakes so high here in the Central Sand Plain on the vineyard, as far as our flora and fauna goes and the vegetation that we're talking about?
Well, Chris can answer, but I'll just start off. It's just a very unique combination of things coming together. I mean, these are very coarse sands. It's hard for things to grow. The rare species rely on specific plants for their life cycle, so it's a critical habitat for many species. But Chris can elaborate.
Yeah, no, that's right, Paul. And so what's so special about Correllus is exactly what you're saying. It's based on these very harsh conditions. So the natural communities here are very rare, in fact, globally significant. And because of that harshness, the species associated with these communities are highly, highly specialized and really not found beyond the footprint of these types of habitats. And so plantation removal is so important from a biodiversity perspective on this landscape. Essentially, it's been determined that these plantations are a primary threat to these natural communities. They are non-native, planted intentionally. They are just counter to what this landscape is trying to express. And these plantation habitats are not supporting the highly specialized species on this landscape. And, the footprints of the plantations are one thing, but the other thing that's happening is that these plantations, through their seed rain, are starting to spread, infiltrate, and degrade the rest of the natural communities on this landscape. So it's Heritage Program, others have determined that not only because this is a globally, regionally significant landscape, but these plantations are a primary threat to that landscape.
I got it.
Hey, look who's Bob. Nice to see you thank you, Chris.
Hi, all.
Bob, do you have a question? Good to see you from afar.
Did I get the time wrong with the time zone differences? Have you been on for an hour or so?
No, maybe half an hour.
Okay, I thought it began at 10.
I don't know if you had okay, so you didn't see the presentation, but this is being recorded, so you'll have a chance to.
Yeah, sorry
Do you have
about
any
that.
questions while you tuned? I don't know what time it is there, but any questions you want to? We have Natural Heritage with us. We also have our DCR partners.
I just am pleased to hear Chris reiterate the biological uniqueness and importance of the area and the need for considerable restoration work to bring the forest back to a sand plain habitat. Some of us wish the forest had been named the Heath End Reservation permanently, or the Martha's Vineyard Sandplain Reservation, which would imply not a forest, but an open, fire-dependent community. Maybe that'll happen someday.
All right, Paul and then Karen.
Okay, I was just raising my hand. I wasn't sure if you saw Karen's hand.
Well, it's not set up that way. So
Set up, we don't have to let it.
I'm putting them in the waiting room if I don't recognize them.
Wi-Fi in here sucks. So they're just like going through to try to like vet people basically.
Elise? Elise?
Dan, that's also us.
Okay, great. All right. Yeah, if everyone could go on mute, if you're not speaking, it would be helpful. And Norma Costain, I don't want to mute everyone, but I did when I needed to.
Norma.
Norma, great.
So Paul, who was speaking? Paul?
I think Karen, you were in the middle of speaking.
Okay, Karen, go ahead.
Sorry about that.
Sure, I just wanted to point out that we identify these as barrens, but this is really a mosaic of community types that are found there, from oak woodland through barrens and heath, and the composition or the amount of any certain type of community that's there really depends on a number of things. But the primary communities are the oak woodlands and the scrub oak shrublands within this particular section of the state forest. And so these plantations are embedded within those. They are also those oak woodlands and shrublands, and the scrub oak shrublands are native to that area. They're adapted to that environment, as Chris said, in the harsh growing conditions. And they also are highly fire influenced. They're fire adapted. They have, volatile sort of characteristics related to their fuel type. And the plantations pose an increasing risk associated with that, where as fire moves through these areas, in the event of wildfire, those understory fuels and the canopy fuels actually create an extreme fire risk for fire control on the island. And I'm sure Dave's going to talk about that. But, we have to address that, and that's really important. And we have to acknowledge the complexity of the community types that are there and our responsibility toward that.
Thanks. Great. Thank you, folks. Okay.
Just finishing up with anybody from the task force or DCR that had comments.
And Tim Bowen has also joined us. All right. Any further questions, comments from the task force or our state partners before we go to public comment? All right. With that, sorry for the interruption. Thanks for staying with us and coming back. We'll open it up to our neighbors who joined us here today.
I don't mind talking.
Michael? All right, if you could just identify yourself. Thank you.
I'm a photographer here on the island, and I have one goal only, and I'll make sure I don't go more than 3 minutes, maybe 2, is that I want additional discussion. I came to this process just a month ago. I had no idea that this was going on. Shame on me for having all this time passed. But as someone who takes pictures, I cherish the forest. So I'll have that out front so that I'm biased, because I love that place. And over the years, I've defended the DCR. I've taken many pictures over the last 8 or 9 years. Hundreds of people have reached out to me, say, where is that place? It looks amazing. And so I've directed lots of folks there. And I congratulate the DCR in creating an environment that almost approaches an old growth forest with a short walk. And it's been meaningful to many people on the island. And so whether you accept that as being a valid reason or not, I can't judge, but I can only tell you that it exists. Secondly, I have a lot of social media followers because of the work that I do in trying to help the island out and so on with my photos. And I was so upset that I did a short video. That video, I believe you may have seen it at the DCR, now been viewed 17,000 times. We've accumulated over 1,000 signatures. So my goal is back in 2022, you had a comment period. Input. You didn't get a single comment. And I think this now shows that that wasn't due to lack of interest. It was due to lack of knowing. I had no idea. I'm not going to try to assign fault. Bottom line is that you have thousands of people out there that are now interested in this process. And so what I'm asking for is that since this has been kicking since 2001, how hard or how difficult would it be to extend this and involve some of the community so that many of the questions can be answered? Since I posted those things, many of the people are directing things towards me. Some nice, some not so nice. But I try to ride through that. So basically, the questions that I'm getting hit with, and I don't expect any answers, I'm not looking for them, but I think in a community forum, we'd be looking for something like this, is that, man planted the plantations, but it's also a minority within the forest. There's 5,300 acres, and you're trying to achieve this sandplain environment, but the minority of the trees are what's being focused on, that this additional 175 acres. People are saying, what's with the other 100 acres out there? Why is that not being addressed in this plan? Why is that not being a discussion point for these species that are considered to be rare and potentially extinct? Another question is, has anybody inventoried the wildlife that's going to be killed and destroyed and displaced in the pine forest that exists currently? There are, since I visit there, I know about the seasonal birds and such that visit that area. Those forests will no longer be available to support those kinds of those things. And so, I mean, again, it doesn't seem to be any information on that. And then the intervention, we said the pines were man-made. But we're also in the process of creating a sandplain that's going to need constant maintenance over the years. For the research I've done, sandplain development has about a 60 to 80% chance of actually supporting the environment those that initiated it hoped that it would achieve. And it's a decade-long process, not years. And then in some other places in Massachusetts, you've had to use even herbicides and other things to be able to keep those more aggressive species from re-entering the plain. So it is a man-made environment, even though the pines are considered to be a liability because they were planted by man. These are just questions that I think people want to know. So in the end, it really comes down to a judgment. Dan and I, friends, this isn't personal against anybody. I believe well-meaning person, but there's a whole other perspective that looks at this small segment of pines in this large forest as being a treasure. It doesn't exist on Nantucket or Block Island. If we truly want a diverse forest, why don't we maintain some of this character without trying to take the whole thing down? And I've seen notes that some folks want to take down the entire 800 acres of the pines because they believe that's not what was here initially, and that's what needs to be here going forward. That's a judgment. There are folks on the other side that judge differently, and I'm asking for an opportunity to be able to sit at the table to have those discussions. Okay.
Thanks, Michael. Also, I believe you're all on mute coming in here, so just raise the digital hand, and I'll be on the lookout, and I can unmute you. So I think just to simplify, we'll first take comment from inside the room here, then we'll turn to those on the screen. But if anyone, from state agencies wants to respond to anything, just raise your hand again and I can see the prompt and unmute you accordingly. Andrew.
Thank you. My name's Andrew Woodruff, and farmer here on the island for 55 years. Have enjoyed this forest for my entire life, doing many different types of recreation. I support a lot of the concepts that are being talked about here today. But I also have a lot of concerns, and I've submitted a letter, And if I could just summarize that letter, it would basically reiterate what, Michael had said here, that I think there really needs to be an opportunity to engage further in the community about this. I have a whole lot of suggestions. I have thoughts about this, but I don't think it's really the place to kind of air it out or even spend the time trying to inquire about the details and the kind of questions that I would have.
I think this is the place.
Well, I feel like there needs to be a lot more public input on this process. That's the number one thing that I want to mention. I feel like there's a serious fire risk. As a farmer, I live and breathe the weather every day, and I'm super concerned about that. But I'm also concerned about the way in which we go about this. And I think this white pine wasn't really meant to be there. I used to actually cut white pine out there back in the 80s. And I think it needs to be phased out over time in a really wise way that's also looking at the whole entire ecosystem of the forest. We're more than likely going to lose the 200 acres or more of pitch pine out there. I'm wondering whether or not we're prepared for that in this plan. We have white pine spreading all over the forest. I think that it's a higher priority to minimize the footprint of this white pine spread before actually attacking the main stands. And that's a fairly simple and easy process. We could be spending the next 2 decades or decade working on these smaller concentrated stands while the spread is just continuing to happen all over the forest. Those are just a few things I'm thinking about. Widening the fire lanes to me would make so much more sense as one of the first steps in this process. And that might include reducing the footprint of some of the major pine stands. I think there's valuable lumber out there. I think if you could thin some of these stands, give it another 20 years, eventually you could harvest this material and naturally allow native plants to come back in over time. And I cannot understand why there was a mitigation demand here 2 years ago based on widening fire lanes. That makes no sense. All the rare species are in the fire lanes, as I understand it, most of them. And that would be something I would think we would be encouraging, and I don't even know why mitigation is in the conversation here regarding that work that was done years ago. So there are other things I would like to say. I'm gonna stop there, but I really hope that this process can really engage more with the local community. I think one of the really positive things here is that we have 1,000 people that are showing a lot of care about this forest for the first time ever. And I don't think we can walk away from that at this point in time. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Jesse or Chris, did you want to respond to any of those comments? I got to unmute him. Sorry about that, Chris. Thanks for your patience, everyone.
We have it. Thank you. I'll defer to Jesse on the mitigation aspect of it, but I did want to address the actual plantation removal in regard to the pioneering white pine question, because it's something that we've thought a lot about. Essentially, you're exactly right. The white pines are proliferating throughout. That is a serious issue, and we are concerned about that, and we're dealing with that. The idea of focusing on the plantations is to remove the seed source while in concert with dealing with the proliferating white pine. If we were to just focus on dealing with the white pine that's pioneering into those natural communities, we would constantly be chasing that because that seed rain would constantly be occurring. So the mitigation focused on the plantation removal, essentially to remove that seed rain, while the Heritage Program, MassWildlife, is partnering with DCR in thinking of other ways that we can deal with the proliferating white pine. So it's essentially, we're looking at this as a 2-for-1 in a sense. We're looking at this holistically. This plan that we're talking about right now is only dealing with the plantations because that's what's on the table. But at a higher level, we're thinking about the integrity across the entire forest.
Right.
Dan,
Jesse,
if I
go.
could also speak a little bit to the comment about mitigation. And it's a good question. So the rationale there was that when the fire lanes were proposed about nearly 25 years ago, most of those areas at that time were and what are now fire lanes most of those areas, again, were oak, woodland, and scrub oak barren habitats. And so the conversion of those areas to fire lanes, which are being maintained more as sandplain grasslands and heathlands, that's a different community type that supports some of the same species, but many of them are not supported in those areas. And so the mitigation was to remove and restore these plantations, which are currently providing no or minimal habitat for those species that use the oak woodlands and the scrub oak barrens, and to convert those areas back to those native habitats. And again, it'll be a matrix of those likely in the end. So it's a different cadre of species, and under the Endangered Species Act and under permitting requirements, we have to ensure that when a take of those listed species occur, all of those listed species are benefited at the end of the day. So I think that's an important, I guess, distinction and something that I wanted to mention. And I would also say too that underlying vegetation is just a really critical component that we need to keep coming back to. State listed species, I mean, that was why the permit was issued. That's what the Endangered Species Act requires us to focus on. But I think the state listed species are in many ways just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the native specialist species that are using these habitats and using these specific sandplain vegetation. Just one example, scrub oak. Scrub oak is a specialist species, or I should say two species. And there are 12 state listed species that depend entirely on scrub oak itself. But there are over 80 specialist species that use scrub oak. So again, the state listed species are, again, the tip of the iceberg. Pitch pine is another good example. On the vineyard, there's one state listed species that uses pitch pine. I think 4 across the state. There are 350, or over 350 native specialist species that use the native pitch pine. So again, it's important to bring it back to the underlying vegetation and what species are associated with that. And before I mute myself, I'd ask if Chris or Karen would like to add anything to that or expand on that in any way.
Just one really quick thought, because it's something that is another important aspect to consider here that you're alluding to, Jesse, is this idea of specialist species versus generalist species. And so when we look at these plantations, they're generalist species, and not only is their biodiversity incredibly low versus the native natural communities around them, but the species that are relying upon these plantations, because they're generalist, they're not even expected to be displaced. They'll simply just shift because they can deal with a wide suite of conditions and species. And so it's not even really this question of winners versus losers. It's just almost this idea of, if we can get the integrity back into this community, which these plantations are a critical part of that equation, we'll be gaining this enormous amount of biodiversity, but not really losing what's there. So it's that, I think that perspective is very important. I hear a lot that it is a decision, winners versus losers. In reality, that is not what we're seeing when we do this work. We very rarely lose species from our sites.
Thanks, Chris. David, your hand went up along with Michael's. You want to?
Sure.
Go.
Thanks. Thanks to Paul. This was a very good presentation and added quite a lot of information to what we've heard previously. I have a couple of quick questions. First, Paul, it would be really helpful to me if you could provide a map showing the areas that have been harvested, say since since Hurricane Bob by DCR, because I do think it's really important. As we've heard from a number of people, and as I think that Chaz has suggested and may suggest further, that there has been a lot of harvesting. It would be good to be able to see what some of that harvesting looks like. So if you could provide that map, that would be very helpful. It would be really helpful to me if, I mean, I agree with all the calls for a kind of halt to the rapid pace of preparations for management, and an opportunity to consult broadly with the community and with a variety of other people who know an awful lot about the forest and also management going on there. Because I think every time we have one of these discussions, we're learning a lot more and new issues get raised. So, for example, one thing that would be really helpful to have would be an estimate of how much on the vineyard, and then within Correllus, how much of this sand plain habitat actually exists. We have a recent new comprehensive map that Chris Siddell and others have been involved in developing. It would be really helpful to know, what are we starting with and what are we adding with this new activity. Another question that I have, Paul, that I think really needs to be discussed in detail is the question of how the harvesting would be done. When we were in the field, you mentioned that, and you just mentioned that there'd be skidders used, and that part of that activity would be to scarify the soil. And then when Chris came and gave his presentation, he said that effectively destroying the organic layer of the soil was going to be incredibly important part of the harvesting process. And his rationale for that was that it would be impossible to do controlled burns with a deep organic soil, that that wouldn't be allowed. It wouldn't be possible to effectively undertake that. But if you go back to the original report that we wrote, we acknowledge that there's a tremendous amount of native vegetation in all these plantations. There may also be quite a lot of native propagules in the soil. We said it was critical to not disturb the soils, precisely because we've seen many instances where disturbance to the soils leads to a proliferation of both non-native invasive species and dense invasion of things like white pine and pitch pine. So that's another kind of issue that would be really important to kind of talk through and understand. And my final question, or my final point, deals with really with the fire ecology and fire assessment here. And I've got 2 points. One, in every literature that I can think of, white pine is considered to be a fire tolerant, and in many cases, a fire dependent species. And so it's very interesting that we're talking about replacing it with species that are fire tolerant and fire dependent, because that's exactly what it is as a native species throughout its range. But I also have a question just about the assessment of fire danger. No one has referred to what I think is the only comprehensive study of fire behavior, fire threat, fuel loading on the forest. And that was undertaken under the guidance of Bill Patterson by Adam Mao 20 years ago. And Adam's conclusion actually aligns diametrically in opposition to most of the assertions that have been made. He calls scrub oak chaparral and says that it is the most dangerous fuel loading that we can have. And I think he would throw grasses in there as well. He actually advises leaving the plantations because they actually tend to suppress fire and carry fire less rapidly. So I would like to see a timeout, an opportunity to reconcile these various facts that I've just listed, and to hear out the kinds of comments that knowledgeable people on the island and outside might add to this conversation and the discussion of how to move forward. Thanks.
Anyone want to respond?
I would like to. Unfortunately, I don't know how to raise my hand, so I'm going to have to jump in on occasion.
Oh,
there was a
well,
lot
good.
there to
Go
unpack.
ahead.
And I'm sure Karen and Chief Salino are probably very interested in dealing with the fire aspect. I will say about the Mal report, his recommendation or his conclusion was that oak woodland was probably the best outcome from a fire safety point of view on this landscape. That is the intended goal of this restoration. So there's that. Stepping back to the soil aspect, I did not say that we will be purposefully destroying the organic layer. What I had said was we were going to be disrupting the duff layer that had accumulated from the years of thatch underneath this to expose the latent seed bank underneath. Enormous difference between thinking about those two aspects. I have notes here. Yes, please.
Can I just ask? Yeah, I mean, I think we're saying the same thing. The organic layer is the duff and organic material that sits on top of the mineral soil. And that's what you said we needed to remove in order to be able to conduct fires. So that's exactly the same thing that I'm saying.
Well, framing it as destroying the organic layer is a little different for this kind of a conversation. And I remember when we had this conversation.
David, can you finish responding, please?
Yeah, but just if you look at a soil profile, the O layer is what sits on top of the.
For the sake of this discourse, it's going to be helpful if we can let each other finish.
No, I know, but we're saying the same thing.
But you're interrupting him. Please let him finish.
Yeah, I actually lost my train of thought there, but thanks, Dan, for intervening. I will finish the greater thought on the motivation here, and that is these duff layers that accumulate underneath these plantations essentially act as a blanket that are repressing the native seed bank that's underneath. And these disturbance-dependent species associated with these communities have life history strategies where they will actually lay dormant for up to a century waiting for proper conditions. What this restoration intends to do is to reinstate those proper conditions, right? Sunlight and exposure to mineral soil to allow the native species to germinate. That's the intention. And it's a dual intention for the whole tree harvest. That's number one, to expose that seed bank so we get the native community responding. And when we do this in other places, we see that response literally within one growing season. The other intention is by leaving that mass on the ground, that is a much greater fire hazard than if we weren't removing it post-harvest. And leaving this material on the ground would greatly inhibit the succession of the native community. So I'm sure Karen wants to deal with the fire tolerance of white pine and some of the other safety issues, but I just wanted to set the record straight for the intention of why we're doing whole tree harvest on this landscape.
Karen, go ahead.
Sure. And then I want to make sure that Dave Salino has time, to provide input because his perspective is going to be really important in terms of fire risk. But I will say that fire research shows that white pine is not fire tolerant, and it is usually not considered part of a fire adapted ecosystem, only as a minor component usually. It's such a complex thing to identify fire behavior characteristics of different plant communities. So while the scrub oak shrublands have characteristics of really moderate to high fire intensity, there are other characteristics of the vegetation that occurs in the eastern part of the plains that also have high fire intensity and fire behavior dependent on the season of the year and conditions on the ground, as well as whether we're in a drought period and we actually may be more vulnerable to those plantations, creating a situation where we experience extreme fire behavior because of the ladder fuels that, the pines that ladder into the forest canopy and carry fire into that canopy. We have to remember that those plantations are embedded within a fire maintained ecosystem. So, and that fire on the island carries from the southwest and the prevailing winds to the east, and they are located in close proximity to residential areas, and they increase the risk to those areas if we do in fact get a canopy fire, which is very difficult to control. So the oak woodlands, the scrub oak shrublands, the grasslands, they all have variable fire behavior. The Mao report was interesting. It looked at only certain components of extreme fire behavior. There are other really important studies that were conducted with Bill Patterson on the island, including work of Matthew Duveneck, as well as Claiborne Woodall, that really built custom fuel models showing that a number of communities actually have variable fire behavior and really need to be managed with prescribed fire and other mechanical treatments. So I'm sure Dave's going to, expand upon some of that.
Go ahead, Dave. Chief Salino, are you able to hear us?
You have to unmute.
Yeah, we can't hear you. Yeah, let me. I'm going to prompt you to unmute. Here you go.
All right. Thanks, Dan. Thanks everybody. Sorry, I had to jump off briefly. I'm running between 3 different meetings here this morning, but I want to get back on here. It sounds like I came on just in time. So I'm going to stay away from the fire effects part of it. Karen and Chris answered those perfectly. I agree with Karen that I would not characterize white pine as being resistant, to fire effects. And there's a lot of studies that show that, but I will share from our own personal experience on the ground, burning in Miles Standish or on the island or down on the Cape or in any other areas where we have shrub fuel types intermixed with white pine canopies, in particular stands that are, higher density, that we can get ground fire or group torching transition in those stands very easily, and it's almost certain mortality when we get full consumption in those canopies in the white pine. So let's talk about the risk, and so it is it's a real tough decision when we look at risk to those communities downwind of a potential fire there, and I agree with their assumption that the highest volatility, probably the most fire frequency we're going to see out of those fuels is out of that scrub oak. And we model it as chaparral or southern rough when we do our burn plans. And then I think that under normal conditions, and this is a quote out of the 2007 study from Dr. Patterson, out there, under normal conditions, fires in these pine stands will burn typically only in the surface fuels. And that's under normal conditions. But when we get into dry conditions, when we get into drought, when we get into that alignment of those dry conditions, low humidities, and higher winds, that's when we have a chance to get transition to crown fire behavior. And when we get crown fire behavior in those stands, the spotting potential we know is up to a half a mile. And that is, remember, downwind into those chaparral-like fuels, very volatile. And so that's the hazard that you have to put into the risk to those surrounding communities. And so the last part of this is management. How do we manage that hazard and to try to sort of moderate that risk? We can manage scrub oak, and we've shown that. And so we can manipulate the fire behavior coming out of scrub oak. The whole intent there, if you take the northeast corner of the state forest adjacent to the Dodgers Hole subdivision, we've done a lot of work up there. I think we're in our third cycle of burning in that 120 acres or so in that corner. And what we've done there is we've given Chief Schaefer and his first responsibilities a chance for success with a higher level of safety to get a stop around that corner and that boundary of the forest. And that was the main intent up in that area. By minimizing flame lengths and minimizing fire behavior, it will burn. The other thing that we've learned over the years is that after we did the first entry burn in that unit, we found that fire behavior was very volatile. And so we took it very slow and compartmentalized it into subunits because of the fire behavior. And that's because about 60% of that scrub oak stand was decadent. It had not seen fire in many, many years. And it was very similar to the tragic fire in Yarnell Hill in Arizona that killed the Granite Mountain hotshot crew. Same, almost identical situation. The Weaver Mountains had not seen fire in 65 years. So 4 years later, in the northeast corner of Manuel Correllus, we went back to do a reentry burn, and we found that ignitions was actually challenging for us. And that was because we were dealing with almost 100% live fuel moisture in those shrubs. And so we saw definitely a moderated, a noticeable decreased level of fire behavior under the conditions that we were burning. So we can manage the shrub fuel types. What we can't manage very easily, and there's almost no options, is for the dense stands of white pine, or white pine in particular. We can't go in and thin those stands, to sort of get spacing, and you need up to 60 feet of spacing between crowns to almost eliminate the crown fire spread potential, because the stand will blow down. They're not wind strong, and we know by experience when we go in and try to thin those stands that have been at that high density of basal area for their lifespan, that they are not opened up to wind exposure very easily. And so then what we end up with is a blowdown scenario where we have logging slash as a fuel type, and that's just a whole nother element added to the hazard factor of risk. So it's a game of it's a gamble, if you will. What are the chances and the probability of getting a crown run in that stand that's going to throw spot fires over the state forest boundary? We don't know. We can tell you that we saw some pretty darn erratic fire behavior in the fall of 2024 here across the interior part of the state. And we're seeing those frequencies of flash drought scenarios hit, almost every other year, it seems. And, when Martha's Vineyard is up in that list is anyone's guess. But if it comes, our concern is that we're ready to deal with fire, and there's not much we can do with a crown driven fire event coming out of those stands. And there's certainly nothing that the locals are going to be able to do to stop that until it gets in an area where they can safely engage. So that's a broad picture of the fire risk and potential response challenges.
Thanks for making time to join us today, Chief, across your busy meetings.
Thanks, Dave. Dan, can I ask Dave, Chief Salino to discuss the responses that we would be looking for from our mutual aid partners across the state, and when our area became receptive to fire because of the weather conditions that we saw this fall, what state those meetings were in across our Massachusetts. Were they available readily, or would we be taxing the already taxed system? My problem is, as a local responder, is we have a certain capacity that we're able to provide fire suppression for. When I rely on outside resources, I get concerned that the state of the fire weather across Massachusetts is going to be in such a dire way that we're going to need air assets that are already deployed in other areas. Another thing that recently has happened in California, the air assets that were grounded because of the wind conditions, I also have concern about what that may lead to in terms of availability of our mutual aid assets from out of town. Meaning that ground fires require air assets, and if we can't get them in the air, or if they're unavailable because they're busy in other parts of the state, those are my big concerns. Our response models are based off of what we have the majority of with scrub oak, with oak forests. We have the equipment, we have the experience to deal with those things. But in terms of ground fires, as we said, they're very hard to deal with. And one last thing, we're sitting here talking about this cut plan. We're talking about the plantation removal. I always like to remind everybody that this is part of a much larger management plan. We focus in on this area as just being what we're discussing, but remember that there's a much larger plan coming down to talk about how we're going to manage whatever is brought up to. So Dave, sorry for the long introduction there. Just wondering if you might be able to comment on the state, what those resources would.
Sure, I'll make a quick comment, Chief, on the resources, the way that we bring, and by the way, folks, just as a reminder, in Massachusetts, local jurisdiction by law is in place for all fires. So the local fire chief has responsibility on all fires, even on state lands in Massachusetts. So DCR fire asset are a specialized mutual aid asset. And so we bring with us through MOUs and agreements like the Northeast Forest Fire Compact Authority, the Stafford Act, MOU with the Forest Service. And so we have access to outside resources. We saw that used in Connecticut back in the fall. They had a hotshot crew in from California, a crew in from Idaho. They had overhead resources from other parts of the country, and they had air assets in from the National Guard and Maine Forest Service. And so those mutual aid agreements and resources are in play. However, it takes a little bit of time to ramp those up. And so we had an air tanker actually almost inbound to Great Barrington from Quebec to the Northeast Forest Fire Compact Authority back in November for the butternut fire. And we've actually tested that authority on the vineyard. Chief, I'm thinking it was back in 2011 or so. We flew a CL 415 scooper in from Quebec and tested customs at New Bedford, and so we know that it can happen, and they're available, but it's you have to spin that up, and so it's a process. One of the things I think lessons learned, folks, coming out of the last few flash droughts we've had, and a lot of focus has been on the northeastern part of the state, which took the brunt of a lot of large fires in the last 3 years, was that there was very little attention to evacuation planning, in these communities. Yeah, an example is up in Cape Ann, Rockport, Gloucester. we do great at evacuation planning for snowstorms, nor'easters, hurricanes. But we typically have about a 4 or 5 day, warning and ramp up to that. We don't have that opportunity for a wildfire event. And so when you look at Dodgers Hole and the real estate that's there, the values at risk, under the fire conditions that we could see coming out of that fuel type, there's not a lot of time there to get folks out of harm's way if that unfortunate event happens, right? And I'd like to say,
Thank you, Chief.
I'd like
Sorry.
to say that it's low frequency, folks, but we're looking at, the areas that nobody ever thought would burn: Maui, Gatlinburg, Tennessee, even parts of LA, folks, that burned, in those unfortunate events, into LA proper within the city limits. Nobody really expected that to happen, because once it goes structure to structure, it becomes a whole different animal, right? I don't know if that answers your question, Chief.
Thank you, Chief. I saw a hand in the back, gentleman with the scarf.
I'm Peter Norris. I live in Chilmark, and I have a question and a comment. So I just want to be really clear that Mother Nature is taking care of the red pines in the forest. DCR is proposing to take care of the white pines in the forest, and the southern bark beetle, the pine bark beetle, is going to take care of the pitch pines. So is DCR basically asking the community to accept a forest that has no conifers? And my second question is, as far as public safety from the forest fires, I would think that the populated North Shore of the island, where you've got a lot of homes interspersed in very heavily wooded areas, where there's a lot of accumulated brush from decades now, poses a huge risk to public safety from forest fires compared to the risk from forest fires coming out of the state. Maybe you could comment on that.
I could comment, Dan, on the part there. We do notice that as fire managers, we can't do anything on private lands. We work great with our partners in the fire service, and Josh is there in the room. There's no better person, in our state than Josh, planning Firewise events and messaging the importance of this and bringing collaboration together to help mitigate some of those issues. But you can't force every landowner to get a 30-foot buffer between their home and the fuels, unfortunately. And so in the forest, we've had a strategic plan to work along that northern boundary to really mitigate the fire behavior. And that's why in the northeast corner, I think we're going to be on our third rotation here, putting fire into that unit. We're still trying to dial in on what the frequency is. It's somewhere between 4 and 6 years between burns, but all the way along that northern boundary, all the way over to the West Tisbury Triangle, is where we're trying to maintain that boundary of lowered fuel loading in that area for that reason.
Thank you, Chief. Gentleman, that.
John Previan, West Tisbury. I want to step back a second, make sure I kind of understand the whole overall picture here. The goal is to establish some sandplain grasslands in the national forest, in the state forest. And to do that establishment or recreation, you're going to get rid of the white pines because they're holding that establishment back. And then you're going to establish some scrub oak where the white pines were. So, because that's part of the sandplain grasslands. And though everybody I talk to, especially fire specialists, and what I heard here today says, yes, the scrub oak has a higher fire risk. That's okay. We can manage that fire risk better than we can manage the white pine fire risk. Is that what I'm hearing?
From my fire perspective, that is right. What the white pines are, there is no management for the white pines as they stand for fire risk. Can you help me out with that, Josh?
Yes, so a crown fire through those things, when you look at the fires in the past, so it was a joint base Cape Cod. One that the tactic was to try to get in front of it. Kind of like you saw last week at the fire on Long Island, and a fire over the weekend on Long Island. The tactic was to line up in front of it and try to get the fire to come to you, but that's not really a safe option. We don't want to put our firefighters at risk. So by having that lower intensity and that scrub out, you know, we can do some of our other tactics that we do, like burning off, mechanically indirect by maybe burning stuff out. So there's other options that we have and have some better chance of success. Our firefighters safe.
But crown fires don't start in the crown. They ladder up. And people I talked to got a very chilling text from one of them about this, because two of my sons live in LA and were evacuated. And the text, I questioned somebody and the response was one sentence: scrub oak equals chaparral equals Palisades and Eden fire. That was it. So I'm just saying, you're asking to replace the white pines because they're in the way of a sand plane. And that replacement will be a higher fire risk than what's there now.
If they're not managed, I think that may be, I don't disagree with the flammability that we see from scrub oak. But what the difference that I'm seeing here myself and why I'm in favor of this is that we can have prescribed fires in a scrub oak environment to reduce the fuels and manage it in a way that reduces the risk factor. I don't have an option. There isn't a plan other than to remove the white pines to eliminate that aspect. Every minute that a crown fire is going, it has the potential to be creating spot fires up to a half mile away. And I have no response for that other than to respond to house fires after they potentially have there. And once it goes structure to structure, the resources on the island, I don't have to. So
I'm just making the point that the goal of establishing the sandplain grasslands has this cascading effect. To get the sandplain grasslands, you're going to get rid of the white pines. To get rid of the white pines, you're going to reestablish or establish scrub oak. The scrub oak is an acknowledged higher fire risk
when unmanaged.
Karen, did you want to punctuate that before we go to more public comment?
Yeah, I just want to, you know, the goal is to restore a combination of natural communities, including oak woodland, as well as, you know, the shrublands and the interstitial small grassy openings. We all recognize that this was not just one big sandplain grassland. It had this mosaic of native vegetation, and white pine within the central plain was probably not very abundant at any point in time, and that those oak woodland communities, this particular area that was chosen has some representative oak in it. And it was not only chosen for fire control reasons, but because it was felt that the integrity of that system could be restored. So remember that sandplain grassland component is a small focus of the project, and that even within oak woodlands, there is variability within the oak woodland fuel type. And some of those oak woodlands that exist within the state forest actually have understory fuels that carry fire, those high ericaceous fuels and other components that actually are very similar in fuel modeling to what we call that chaparral fuel type. Bill Patterson did a lot of work on that. So we can't just simplistically look at it, one fuel versus another. But as Chief Salino and others have said, we have capability of managing understory fuels with prescribed fire and mechanical treatments. We cannot manage that fuel that ladders into the canopy of these dense plantation conifers.
I just want to, pause for a moment and say, so we typically meet for an hour. We dedicated an additional half an hour. I think this is always the trade-off when we have public comment. We can crowd in a lot of comments, or we can have discourse conversation. I think we're having the latter here. That's by design. I know we'll start losing people who have other places they have to be. But with that, and I will get to you quickly, Josh. AJ, is there anything you wanted to add, just so people are kind of aware if they need to leave early, that there's still an opportunity to contribute and to to comment formally? I'll unmute you. Sorry.
There we go. I think can
There
you
you
hear me,
go.
Dan and folks?
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you, Dan. And I do want to thank the task force and MVC and our DCR staff and MassWildlife staff for providing technical expertise today and for all the previous meetings for the past 5 or 6 months, the task force has held to kind of bring more education around the topic. But DCR is happy to collect additional public comment. So what I'll do is particular folks couldn't make it today, or if they didn't feel comfortable sharing, or if there wasn't enough time. So I'll put a link in the chat here and also share it with Dan so that he can share that with the broader community at large that's in the room. And it will be posted up on our website for the next 2 weeks.
Thank you. Josh and then Ben.
Just one quick thing, I want to piggyback what Chief Salino said earlier. When we look at some of these historic fires, Malibu, Gallenberg, it's those big wind events that happen to be able to do that. We haven't had a lot of those big wind events. We don't have those, warm winds and things like that. The other point that we have done recently a lot is those fuel modeling and fire runs. And California, the other place, it's not this big gigantic wall of flame coming out of the forest, burning people's homes down. It's those embers that are generated by that fire. And when you look at different types of fuels, ground fire versus scrub, and how far those embers are landing. So, we're drastically reducing that ember fallout zone. I put it back to scrub up versus that.
Okay, thank you. Chris, and then I really want to go back to the floor. Sorry, I thought I unmuted you, but I guess not. Here we go.
Perfect, thank you. So Karen said this really well. I couldn't have said it better, but I just want to reiterate a real key component of what she said was that the goal here of the restoration is oak woodland, not sand planting grassland. So I just want to get that out there because we're hearing this a lot and just wanted to set the record straight. That's all.
Thanks, Chris. Ben, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that just raised another question. We've heard grassland, heathland, oakland, oak barren, scrubland, and oak woodland. It's unclear what's going to happen after. There's no management plan for how you actually get to oak woodland after the clearing. But my question actually is for Paul. You said something sensational. State forest wildfire will remove all the carbon. I think that's a sensational statement. I think we can all kind of agree that even the largest fire will not remove all the carbon. But you said it'll balance out the carbon, and that assumes some level of math has been done by DCR. Can we be provided with your analysis on the carbon budget of the removal from the carbon fuel cost to do the removal work, the lost carbon in the forest, the changes in the soil carbon structure? What math has DCR done to come out with the statement that it balances out carbon?
Okay, I can address that. I can address that. I gotta hear myself twice. We We have a biometrician on staff who is well versed with carbon and doing evaluations of them. And based on his estimates, which there's a lot of based on a lot of contingencies on how you determine numbers and go through the math about it. He determined the first year there would approximately be 2,774 metric tons of CO2 equivalent emissions from the 32-acre project area and 3,953 metric tons CO2 equivalent from the 47-acre project unit. And for perspective, that amounts to 0.5% and 0.95% of average annual net growth of above and below ground live tree carbon across DCR. And another perspective is the average passenger vehicle emits approximately 4.6 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year.
Well, can you provide the task force and the public those calculations? I just jotted it down, really nice to be able to review that.
Sure, I can have, Bill can put together a, report about it and have that.
You wanted to add something?
Bill's here.
Yeah, am I unmuted now? Can you hear me?
Yes.
You're good.
Great, thank you. So yeah, we conducted those calculations and submitted them for review with some of the responses to questions that have been received so far. But the division, the Bureau of Forest Fire Control and Forestry has maintained a network of continuous forest inventory plots across our holdings for the past 60 years, and we're continually adding plots as we acquire more land. We interface closely with the U.S. Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis Program, and so we're able to use a lot of the same algorithms and models for estimating carbon stocks in trees based on the dimensions of the trees that are measured. So we try to prepare these in kind of as apples to apples a format as possible, so that we can put measurements from sites into context. Obviously, there's some amount of uncertainty around how the trees are going to be used in terms of harvested wood products and the exact effects going forward. But generally, what we see is that the forest carbon stocks in pitch pine, scrub oak, barrens adapted communities, there's not as much carbon in the above ground live tree components or the live tree components in general. But because of the more open nature of the overstory, there's more carbon in the understory plants, and there's typically tremendous carbon stores in the mineral soil, in the soil organic carbon in the mineral soil horizons. So what we also find is that from a risk perspective, over the long run, because these communities are fire adapted and we're able to maintain them using the tools for which those communities were adapted for, fire primarily. We find that those low intensity periodic fires are able to, they might release some carbon, but the releases are less than would occur from a severe fire, and recovery is quicker back to basically a net zero or positive carbon balance. So again, we have calculations and references that we'd be happy to share once those releases. And I believe that's the process, right, AJ? Is that we're in the process of reviewing some of those responses right now.
All right, so I had shake.
Can I just throw a question to AJ while you're doing it? You had mentioned there's a 2-week comment period. I don't know if that's a formal comment period. That seems really actually a short period. And if we wanted to be able to comment on some of the information that is going to be provided to the task force and the public on carbon and other things, I think you would want to extend that 2 weeks beyond, so that people can have an accurate time to review that data and comment. Thank you.
Caitlin and Darcy.
Caitlin Jones. I'm curious about the overall funding for this project. I heard it was ARPA funds, and somewhere I think I saw it was like $400,000. Is that still true or not true? What is the budget? And going forward in the timeline for the active management for these woodlands, where's that money coming from and how much is that going to be? And is it going to be available? I mean, I think we've had problems in the past with money in the state forest for just maintaining the fire lanes. Oh, and then the other question I have is if you're gonna take down section B, I think I read in iNaturalist that there's lots of lady slippers there. They're associated with white pine, and there's also a big plot of rattlesnake plantain. I don't know if that's associated with anything, but if that's all gonna be churned up and cut down, is there gonna be an opportunity for the nonprofit groups here to salvage those plants? Even though they're not threatened or subject species, I like them.
Don't see any. Are there any responses? Otherwise, we can.
I'll just comment, with respect to the budget. I mean, I'm too low on the pecking order, but it is the hope that with it would be included in next year's budget, that this would be able to take place.
Darcy.
Yeah. Okay, Darcy Schofield. I'm with the Islands Director of the Trustees of Reservation. I'm also a West Tisbury resident and very close to the state forest. Thank you for this very thorough presentation. I thought it was incredibly informative. My question is going back to the carbon accounting, and maybe this will come out of your report. I am curious of whether the carbon accounting had a measurement of older white pines. So some of these, from your calculations, are 60 to 80-year-old white pines, if I recall correctly from your presentation. What their carbon sequestration productivity is at this stage as they're older versus what the carbon sequestration productivity would be after a harvest with a regeneration occurring so rapidly in these oak woodlands. Does that accounting get taken into consideration? So ultimately we would, if we're losing, say, I think your numbers were 3,000 to 4,000 metric tons of carbon equivalents, how long would it take us to sequester that back with the regrowth?
Bill, go ahead.
Yeah, so just double checking that everyone can hear.
Yes.
We're good.
So, as has been alluded to by some of the other speakers, forests are just far too important to manage for carbon alone. It's really hard to put a dollar price amount on biodiversity, let alone get talked into trading carbon for biodiversity. We could certainly conduct a bunch of fancy modeling and use a bunch of projections and assumptions to try to look at exactly how much would be resequestered or stored in this area to get back to parity. But I also am not 100% sure how productive that would be, since really we're kind of talking about goals among equals, right? Biodiversity is an equal goal to carbon, and what we're really in is the middle of an emissions problem, not necessarily a forest management problem. That being said, we do have data from continuous forest inventory plots that are located within the plantations in the forest. The continuous forest inventory plots are not meant to represent a particular stand. They're at more of a strategic level, but the data from those particular plots shows significant mortality that's being incurred as the plantations begin to break up. The density of trees in those plantations is extremely high, so high that the trees are competing for growing resources. They're overstocked, and so they don't have the vigor to fight against stressors, pests, pathogens, recover rapidly from disturbances in the way that we might hope. So one of the plots is experiencing relatively low net growth of live tree carbon and low overall sequestration of tree carbon once we factor in loss of density and carbon, mass and density and carbon as formerly live trees that are now standing in down dead decay. And another one has negative net growth, which means it's accruing biomass and carbon not as fast as it's being lost to other pools in the atmosphere. So that's indicative of some of the near-term carbon fluxes on the site. And as I mentioned, there's no questioning that carbon is going to be released from the activities, but it's transitioning to a state that, as many others have alluded to and spoken about, it will be less risky. It'll be more naturally adapted to the site, and we will, be likely to see a rearranging of where the carbon is stored in the ecosystem there, but perhaps not any less over the long run, right? We might see less carbon in the above ground live tree pool, but more carbon in soil organic carbon and the understory vegetation. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. I want to take the moment to say, thank you to our state partners. And I will go to the digital screen. I know you've been all really patient if there aren't more hands on the floor, but I just want to thank you. After nearly 10 years here, I've never been involved in a project where the level of involvement and investment from our state partners has been that level of commitment has been there. So I know we do appreciate that. I realize other people have, you may have other meetings to go to. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. So I'd just say that. So Bill, thanks for rounding that out. Any other hands on the floor? Before we go to anyone a second time, I want to make sure we get to everyone who's been waiting for well over an hour. Nancy, you're really on the floor, Nancy. We got Nancy out of the screen, but nonetheless with us here.
Who does know the budget answer? Nobody? We got a lot of state people here.
Oh, sorry, AJ. Right.
So I was trying to raise my hand, but I couldn't find the button for that. So the answer to that can range anywhere between $3,000 to $6,000 per an acre. It depends on the approach and the way DCR and the task force work towards keeping some wood products on island and what would need to be shipped off. So a key piece to this overall process is getting through the cutting plan process. So an RFP and bid documents can be put together and we can identify what the true cost will be. But we'll also be going through the upcoming FY26 budget process. So having some preliminary numbers and looking at the 79-acre approach, we're currently estimating 3 to 6, but the market, I think, as we all know, is fluctuating day to day. And so the true hardcore numbers will be coming in as we do a bid document process.
Thank you, Chief.
I think the question was more about what doing. I heard a question regarding the maintenance of the fire lanes. I believe this was the representation you had. I don't want to speak on behalf of DCR, but I know that there has been commitment for staffing and equipment made in the recent years that is entirely different than any kind of commitment we've seen in the past. So I don't know if you want to enhance that, AJ, but
sure, yeah,
I know for a fact.
Yeah, no, thanks, Chief. And Paul alluded to that towards the end of his presentation. So out of the Martha's Vineyard and the Nantucket teams, we have the one full-time field operations team leader, and we have 3 seasonal staff, which would include 2 during the summer and 1 during the winter months. And then we get additional support from mainland rangers. And then our fire control also has our 1 full-time ranger firefighter who's in the room today to assist on the island, and that's augmented by fire staff from the mainland when needed. And then DCR has also been approved this fiscal year and is posted now an additional full-time park operations position to the forest that will assist Connor. And that position is currently posted. And then I would also add that our DCR has also provided recent investments in machinery that Connor alluded to earlier in the conversation that's been helpful for that maintenance.
Very good. Elia, did I bungle your name?
Sort of. It's okay. It's Ilya.
All right, I'll keep that. Go ahead.
So I appreciate Karen's use of the word mosaic. The white pine is currently a part of that mosaic, and I'm curious to hear if any of the scientists who are currently advocating for this clear cut have specifically studied these stands of white pine. And I just want to open that question up, and then I have one brief comment to make after.
Why don't you make it now, and that way it just be a more seamless transition, I think. Go ahead. Yep.
Okay. Great. Yeah, I appreciate all of the knowledge that you've shared today. It's clear to me that everyone in this room comes with good intentions. From my perspective, nothing about this issue is objective. Both sides are using science to justify disparate ends. And ultimately, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of islanders who believe in the unique value of the pines, given the existence of sandplain elsewhere on the island and early successional habitats. So I think it's clear that the only ethical way to move forward is to allow for more public participation in this process of creating a plan. And I appreciate that there's going to be 2 weeks, if not longer, for people to make public comment. I don't know exactly what the process of engaging the community on a deeper level would look like. But from my perspective, it's necessary. And yeah, I'd say that that's all I have to say for now, beyond sharing that question.
Thank you. Luann, you had a quick response? Let me unmute you here. Sorry. I used to love alphabetized order here, and all right, here you go. I lost you. Luann, you should be able to speak now.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Ilya. I appreciate your question, and I think it's an important point that people bring up, that what's living in these white pines, and are we worried? We're concerned about them, et cetera. And as a wildlife biologist living here on the island for several decades now, I have spent time walking through those white pines and looking at the wildlife that are there and the plants that are there. And I've even thought, maybe bats are using them. But I can honestly tell you that Chris Bulow's characterization that they have generalist species and that they have low biodiversity is very much true. The bats rarely are in there, and it's likely because the understory in there isn't very diverse, so there's not a lot of insect life in there. And when you have that heterogeneity in a woodland versus these monocultures of pines, then that promotes the smaller plants in the understory, the insect diversity, the bird diversity, and everything else that comes in there. And when that's not there, that's what you get, is this low biodiversity. And so I want to reiterate that these pine plantations were planted as plantations. They were planted to be cut. And this plan that's being put forth is for just 79 acres. I think it's a well thought out plan. And that's why Biodiversity Works is supporting it. And there's an opportunity after doing these 79 acres to go back and look at it and see what we've learned from it and how we can move forward. But right now, those pine plantations are taking up habitat that our other native wildlife could be using. And I have to tell you, driving around this island over the last year, I'm seeing clear cuts everywhere for houses, for affordable housing, for nursing homes, for barns, for pools, for everything else. And our native species are being, are declining, and they're being hit, by a death by 1,000 cuts. And this is an opportunity for us to regain some habitat for them that's contiguous with other native habitat. And so it's a good plan. And there's a lot of benefits to it for the wildlife. And as an organization that cares about the island's biodiversity, we think that it is a good way to move forward, and we support it.
Thank you, Luann. Chris, you had something to add? Do I have you muted again?
No, I think I'm good to go. And thanks, Lynn. That was really well
right.
stated. I just wanted to quickly touch upon this idea that there's other sandplain communities elsewhere and that maybe this isn't so important. I just want to kind of set that record straight, right? So first of all, from a biodiversity and scale perspective, Correllus is top 5 in the entire state and really in the entire region. So we're not just looking at an opportunity, we're looking at something of global significance. But the other side of that, it's not just the presence of these natural communities, it's the integrity of the communities. And that's what this plan is really about. We're finding that the #1 threat to these natural communities and to their associated highly specialized species is this degradation that happens over time through lack of management. And so it's not this binary question of do we remove the plantations or do we not? Because we have other occurrences elsewhere, it's what is the end game for all of these occurrences? And if we just step away, we're essentially losing all of these occurrences. So I just wanted to put that perspective out there. Yes, we have other habitat out there. Yes, these species occur in other places, very much so not to the degree that they're occurring in Correllus. And it's a closing window for Correllus. This isn't about just reclaiming the 79 acres. It's about restoring integrity to the greater community of Correllus. And, quickly going back to an earlier point that we made, we're talking about plantation removal here in isolation. This is part of a bigger plan to address some of these other stressors on this site. So just wanted to put that out there.
Thank you, Chris. Ken. Yeah.
Trying to unmute there. I think I'm unmuted. I have a whole page of notes.
Yeah, you're good.
Let me first just quickly introduce myself to those of you who don't know me. I'm in Oregon right now, and I'm a forest ecologist. I specialize in fire ecology, historical ecology. We've been doing a lot of restoration work in oak habitats here in the West, and also I've been working for the last several years on Martha's Vineyard in the design and measuring carbon sequestration and avoided emissions using flame cap kilns to create biochar in the woods. And so I'm just going to narrow my discussion here and I'm happy to add these comments in a written form, my other comments, if Dan can help me connect to the ability to do that. But the point the one point I'd like to make, and I was glad to hear Paul mention earlier on in his introduction that that when wood is charred and turns into charcoal, and it goes into the soil, it becomes biochar. It has a half-life of 1,000 years in the soil, and so what I'm hoping is that as part of this process, we can actually deliberately create more biochar from the slash that's created in the process out there. We have a very low impact process. We just finished a set of measurements last October at Keynes there on the island, where we measured carbon in and carbon out from our flame cap kilns, and we're sequestering 40 to 50% of the carbon in the original feedstock. So with less than half the emissions, certainly of particulates and many of the other emissions, than an open burn or a broadcast burn. So I just hope that we can incorporate deliberate biochar production into that process, and I'll stop here.
Okay. I know we did lose Bill from DCR. But Ken, yeah, if you want to send me any materials you have, I'm happy to distribute.
Okay, great, thanks.
If I misunderstood, if I misunderstood you, we can talk that through some more.
Sure.
Janet,
Yes, can you hear me?
we can.
Okay, great, thanks. Yes, I live in Western Mass. I actually live right near the Montague Plains, so I get to see firsthand how some of this, what this looks like over time. First of all, I'd like to say that, I'm really here just to comment, is that in terms of the fireproofing everybody's house, I think it's actually extremely reasonable for on your island to actually ask people to do that. I mean, if I owned a home and somebody didn't tell me I should do these things like get rid of debris and stuff right next to my house, all the stuff that we know from looking at these fires out west, we're watching the houses burn, but the trees still standing, and that's because the trees have moisture in them and the houses don't. And so so if your concern is like houses catching on fire, it behooves you as a public safety thing to ensure that people do this for themselves and for their neighbors. That's first off, because otherwise we saw fires, supposedly all these big raging fires in the Montague Plains that never ever went to Lake Pleasant, the village. The village burned in Lake Pleasant in 1938 or something because somebody's oil lamp fell over and it never caused a forest fire. So there's just like I think we should just really look at what actually goes on in these situations. Another thing I wanted to comment on is I really wish that you would have this level of discussion on other state properties as well. We feel like we don't have them. I don't know why this is happening so much here. Glad you're doing it, but we have other state forests and large projects like Miles Standish where we would love to have a big discussion there, but we don't get to have one. And the third thing I want to say, and this is a lot about thinking about the Montague Plains, is that when you create this, whatever you're calling it, whatever the name of your thing is out where I am, it's called Pine Barrens Restoration. Just the fact that you have to continuously manage it, right, which is what you're saying, suggests that these are not natural habitats. This is not naturally occurring. And I liken it to a zoo or a monument or a museum where you're actually holding some moment in time historically, like biological, historically, where this would be a moment in time, but and then you hold it there, hoping that these species and moths and stuff come and visit you. In the Montague Plains, it's kind of funny. There's literally thousands of acres being burned and chemicals applied to it consistently and continually as we speak, right near across the street from Lake Pleasant, which is a water supply, literally a few hundred feet away. And as we watch this happen, I'm sorry, I've actually lost my train of thought, but like we're just watching this continuous, constant, endless, it will never stop until they run out of money, in which case they'll let it grow back. But the biologists that we had out there on the ground showed clear evidence that the Montague Plains used to be a hardwood forest. And this is also true at Miles Standish. These were hardwood forests there. These were not these sand plain, big, whatever is trying to be recreated out there. And so if we let nature take its course, which would be the normal thing to do, then you wouldn't be doing this. Oh, but the Montague Plains, I know there's somebody here from the Montague Plains, it was shocking to me that a non-threatened cocoon of a moth was found after thousands of acres and 15 years of intervention out there. This was the big success, literally a cocoon of a moth that's not even endangered. So I just think that this is, I just feel like people should really understand, like what the natural occurrences are. And I don't feel that creating a zoo is a good thing for anyone. So you want to stop the fires, then tell people to fireproof their homes. Thank you.
Okay, Michael, floor is yours.
Yes, hi, thanks.
I'm Michael Kellett. I'm Executive Director of Restore the North Woods. We're a nonprofit organization based in Massachusetts, but we work across New England and beyond. And I don't doubt the best of intentions of the people who are supporting this project, but I think it's a really bad project. Our organization has reviewed the project plan, and we don't think it holds up for any of the supposed scientific biodiversity reasons, and is going to cause a lot of damage unnecessarily. We submitted written comments, so I won't go into detail on that, but I'm also really concerned about this fire alarmism that's more and more being exposed in the East, where fires in the Northeast, fires were basically non-existent on any large scale pre-European settlement. And all the fire stuff we're hearing about is basically goes back to Europe, when the forests were cleared, there was a lot of open early successional habitat, which is what now we're artificially creating more of that, which is the opposite of what we ought to be doing to prevent fires. But the reality is there's little scientific evidence that wildfire is a big threat in the Northeast. And all of this it's effective, though, in scaring the public into supporting management. And I don't think this is an evil plot by the people talking about this, but I've read a lot about wildfire in the West for a long time. There's a lot of science. It's as if the new science doesn't even exist in the discussion I'm hearing. The new science is that fuels are not a major problem with wildfire. It's heat, wind, drought, and a source of ignition. And that the best thing you can do for wildfire, as Janet mentioned, is to help people harden their houses and clear in the wildland urban interface around the house if need be, but going out in the forest and cutting down trees, thinning, prescribed burning is really not effective if there's really a serious wildfire. And serious wildfires are basically non-existent in the Northeast. That Long Island fire that was mentioned, that was a grassland fire. It wasn't a forest. I'm really concerned about that. You read in the newspapers about this horrible threat of fire, and you're talking about a couple hundred acres here and there at the most that are burning. We really need to stop talking about these apocalyptic sort of things, talking about biodiversity. There's no evidence that there are any endangered species that require us to clear standing forests in Massachusetts to save species that are endangered over their natural range. I was a first author on a peer-reviewed paper where we looked at this issue. So I'm just concerned. Obviously, people can have their own opinions, but I'm really concerned that there's really sort of a fact-free lack of real scientific debate about these issues. This is a really one-sided sort of discussion, and the public is not getting the full story. So anyway, thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you, Michael. Karen, you had a response?
I first wanted to mention that that species at Montague Plains was not a moth. It was a species that's a candidate for federal listing, the frosted elfin butterfly. And, regionally it's declining. And there's lots of information that we can provide Janet and others if they're interested in that. I agree that barrens are complex, and oak is a keystone species within that system. Historically, oak had a much greater prominent role, but related to European settlement and colonization, pitch pine became more dominant. So that's how they're referred to currently. Oak is still dominant in many of these systems within the Atlantic coastal area and some of these inland bights. But we all recognize that it's a unique environment that's found on deep outwash sands, and the species that are restricted to those areas are really, they were probably always somewhat rare, but our job is to try to and make sure they're not extirpated, right? And so there's a lot of generalizations that sometimes we make in discussing some of those things. The other important thing I want to mention is that there is a lot of interest in paleoecological studies and recent paleoecological studies, and those that were done specifically related to some of those systems. And those studies that actually look very closely at the fine resolution charcoal analysis in relation to specific cores show that there is evidence of fire pre-settlement within that period, as well as post-settlement, that is really important. And it shows the influence of fire within that system for the past 1,000 years to 2,000 years. Now, the Charzy and the other interpretations are not the same. And so that's a discussion with fire ecologists that I think needs to happen. And Michael would be happy to have that discussion with you and, provide some of that work that Bill Patterson and others have done in the region.
Thanks, Karen. And Chief Salino also added over 663 wildfires burned 4,000 acres in less than 60 days across the state in October and November of 2024. We have two more hands. I'm going to go to Anna and then Norma. Oh, sorry. Let me get you teed up here. Sorry about that.
Hi, I'm not Joanna. My name's John. Joanna's my wife. She's sitting next to me. Her screen name's up there. Appreciate everyone's time. Obviously, a lot of thought and effort's been put into this. I have to say, I agree with Ilya and Michael and some of the other folks who have expressed significant concerns about this plan. I was one of the over 1,000 signers of a petition opposing this plan. And the reason I signed it is because it seems to me like a solution in search of a problem. I hear terminology coming from this group of harvesting, a plantation, and restoration. But I think to anyone who lives on the island and drives by this beautiful forest, we're really talking about chopping down a healthy forest. To me personally, it doesn't matter how it got there. I don't care if it was there since 1920 or 1820 or 1420. It's a healthy forest. It's there. I think it should be left alone. When it comes to healthy forests that are not posing an invasive threat or a vital imminent fire threat, I believe that the status quo should be preserved. The default should be to leave healthy forests alone. This seems to me to be a judgment call on the part of DCR in the name of its subjective view of biodiversity. It seems to me that DCR wants to selectively remove one habitat and replace it with another, picking winners and losers in nature. To me, that just seems wrong, and I really hope you guys know what you're doing. I have two questions. The first is this. At the beginning of the meeting, I heard the first gentleman who was presenting say that this was a required thing to do. And he was talking about some permits that were issued years ago and then amended. And so my first question is this plan as articulated required under Massachusetts law, or is this a discretionary decision that DCR is choosing to undergo? That's number one. Number two is, what is the state's plan for selling this lumber from these thousands and thousands of healthy trees? To who is it going to be sold, for how much, and is this going to yield the state a net profit? Thank you.
And if I may, I also have a few questions, but if you want to answer his first, it's fine.
Oh, a 2 for 1. All
Yeah,
right.
you heavy hitters.
Johanna's husband. Sorry if I missed your name. Could you just say it one more time if I missed it?
Yeah, my name is John Sweet.
Thank you, John. All right. I know Paul Gregory, the forester who gave the presentation, had to leave. But I believe the kind of the nuance of the permit was discussed by Jesse Ledick at MassWildlife earlier. Jesse, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to clarify there or not. We still do have some DCR contingent here. Oh, you can't talk, can you?
Sure.
There you go.
Just to John, answer your direct question about whether the plan is required under state law. Yes, this is required under a conservation and management permit that was issued under the Massachusetts Endangered Species Act, and the Endangered Species Act requires that when a take of listed species occurs, you have to mitigate for those impacts so that the affected species are left better off in the end. There's a net benefit to those impacted species. And that's where this plan originated, and it is required under the Endangered Species Act. So I just wanted to address that it's not a discretionary decision.
And I think there's a simple answer to the second question, but I'll let DCR respond to that if they'd like.
AJ, you want me to take a crack at that?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I just want to point out that these sections of the forest that we're proposing, this in A and B, these are not a healthy stand forest. If you go out and look at them in the section A on the north side, it's almost entirely evergreen. The pine is far too dense. This pine was planted with the intention of harvesting it. It was planted in a way that in a normal plantation, you go in over time and remove some of those pines. This was not the case. It's grown in too dense in the area that's section D, which is south. That area has new trees, regeneration of pines coming up underneath what is the older mature pines. That pine has been hit with pine beetle, so there's a lot of top kill in there. There's thousands of dead trees in there. The overstory is too crowded, hence the hazard for a crown fire. But there's also the ladder fuels from the regeneration of the white pine underneath. That regeneration is also too dense. We call that dog hair stand in there because it's very dense like a dog hair, to the point where it's very difficult to go through there, making it impossible to navigate in a wildfire or prescribed fire scenario. So this isn't a static thing, putting in as a zoo, these are an organic process that the forest is constantly changing, is constantly, evolving. So management that we'd be doing is, for the most part, mimicking natural processes. If we were to get a hurricane and you get a whole section leveled down, so you can find, a 3-acre pocket of trees that have been taken down hurricane or by wildfire. So what we're doing is trying to mimic natural processes. So you shouldn't be afraid of change because it is something that naturally occurs in the forest. But, because it's proximity to homes, we can't really allow a wildfire to go through there and take a natural course. So what we're trying to do is just mimic natural process.
Thanks.
John,
And as
Thanks,
far as
Connor.
making a profit, there would not be any profit turned.
Correct. It's quite frankly, it's very costly for to do forestry work on the island because the limited market that's on the island and the demand and need to ship materials and ship equipment in raises the cost drastically.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm
Okay,
Joanna.
Johanna and then Norma, and then I'm gonna just remind people there is a 2-week comment period to submit additional comments, and then we'll wind it down. Go ahead.
Great. I would like to start there. I reject the idea of a 2-week comment period. I think it makes it seem to the thousands of people that are against this plan, and I say thousands because there are many more that will sign the petition. This is a state forest and it affects people across the state. It makes it seem like you're in a rush to get it done. And if this is a project that is important and, you guys think, provides benefits, then what is the rush? The people have a right to process this information. I would first ask, is this subject to NEPA review? And if it is, which it is, the people should be able to digest the NEPA report before they have to make comments. I also want to remind the team that there are laws, regulations within NEPA that says you can't segment by phase to avoid NEPA review. So when I hear comments about phase 1 or someone saying 79 acres, it's a much bigger project than that. So my question is about NEPA review, and my reminder is that you cannot segment by phase to avoid NEPA review. I also would like to know if federal funding is being used to pay for some of this project. And if so, what is the plan for submitting a Section 106 report? Another thing. So question about, will the state make money off of this? And you answered that, maybe not. But this is a transactionary project. Right now, the forest isn't, making money. But when you start bringing in construction vehicles and you take in, you're using the fuel to make those machines run, paying people to manage the land, selling the lumber, which is in the minutes of one of your last meetings. I mean, this makes the forest it's becoming a bit of a business. And I think that is very concerning. And like my husband said, and I agree, you guys are attempting to fix something that isn't broken. The forest is serving the people. Taking the forest away is not an ecological restoration program, it's a resource extraction by DCR. Pitting the people against pine trees is a disinformation campaign. And I really hope that, I don't actually have many, I don't expect the DCR to back down, but I really hope the good people of Martha's Vineyard and across the state will stand up against it. Thank you.
Jesse, did you want to respond at all to the MIPA component of that?
Can you tell us what MIPA is?
Massachusetts Environmental Protection Act.
Yeah, I would be happy to. But before I jumped in, I just wanted to see if there's anybody at DCR that wanted to speak to that first.
Paul's missing Jesse, so I'll let you talk about the MIPA. But in terms of the funding question, the intent right now is not to use federal dollars. As we go through the FY26 budget process, there'll be more identified, but no federal dollars at this current time.
Thanks, AJ. So in terms of MIPA review, and I guess I want to make it clear that this is a DCR project under a DCR permit. So I'm going to speak to this as best I can, but really this is a question that DCR should answer and confirm. It's my understanding that this project and the original conservation and management permit that was required for this project did go through MIPA review. That happened many years ago when the original project was proposed and permits were issued. And so my understanding is it did go through the MIPA review process. Johanna is right that MIPA doesn't typically allow project segmentation, and that's, in my view, not what is happening here. The project is well known. It's fully described. Projects do happen in phases for various reasons, and that's allowable as long as the full project is reviewed, and that is happening and has happened in this case. So I think segmentation is really not an issue that is that we need to, I guess, focus on, because again, we are looking at the full and complete project here.
Thanks, Jesse. And I misspoke. Paul's still here. Paul, did you have any addition to the MIPA process?
Looks like Bill had something to add as well from your team.
Great.
Oh, sorry, Paul. Go ahead, Bill, for now.
Yeah, sorry, I wouldn't be able to speak to the MIPA component, but I just addressing the component of the whether or not the existing plantations are healthy or functioning. I mean, there's certainly some value in there, but I would just reiterate that some value judgments, but would also reiterate that some of the data associated with the plantations show some significant mortality that's occurring as they begin to break up due to lack of growing space, resources, in essence, things like that.
Thank you, Bill. Paul, anything to add, or did your partners cover it?
Oh,
you're unmuted, Paul.
Oops, sorry.
You're
Can
good.
you hear me? Right. I was looking at my notes, and the MIPA filing was September 8th, 2001. So it did officially go through the environmental monitor and the MIPA steps.
Norma.
Hi. So I'm a land conservationist here on the island, and I just have some comments. I want to say that the forest, especially the plantations in the forest, are a problem. I know that some users of the forest, recreational users, don't believe that to be the case. And I understand that, because you walk on those paths and you look at those trees and you're having this lovely experience. I've rollerbladed in there for years. I've ridden my bike in there for years, and I've hiked in there for years. I've had incredibly satisfying experiences walking through the state forest. But the plantations are not healthy. They're simply not healthy. There is lots and lots of science that will tell you that they're not healthy. And they were planted in an area that was a sandplain grassland. And that, as your scientists here have said, is a globally rare habitat. We as humans develop land. That's what we do. We develop land for housing. We develop it for commercial development. And that's what this was. This was a planted lumber development. So all the existing nature has been wiped out once again on Martha's Vineyard to accommodate these trees, which was abandoned by the people who planted them. It's irresponsible for people to have a plan that they can't bring to fruition, right? I mean, it happens sometimes, I understand that, but we're left with this legacy of a dead monoculture forest that has taken away from healthy ecosystems that support biodiversity. And I think it's really sad. And I really appreciate all the work that's gone into this by the state and all the supporting partners, especially the task force here on the island, because they look at the hard science and they appreciate the value of our state forest. It's a rare part of our island and part of our region to have that many acres, 5,000 acres protected. And the plantation is the exact opposite of that. So to bring it into the umbrella of a healthy state forest in that it will be returned to native habitat that will support a lot of biodiversity is just a great thing. And I think it's the pinnacle of human ambition to try to undo the damage that we have done. Wildlife on this island has been pinched and pushed out. And as Luann Johnson said earlier, it's death by 1,000 cuts. Snakes can't cross roads, they get run over. You know, bats don't have the habitat they need to roost and successfully procreate. And we need those creatures in our habitats. So that's just two examples. But as many have said here before, these were planted to be harvested and they were left behind. And we need to pull them out. And I think the plan sounds very sound. One last comment is that somebody earlier was talking about how the Northeast doesn't have fire risk, that we don't need to be managing for fire. That is one element of the plan. And I would, respectfully disagree. Perhaps historically, we haven't had wildfires in the Northeast to a degree that you have to manage forests for wildfire. But I would say that from today going forward, our risks are increasing, and they're increasing at a high rate. As the fire professionals have said, the biggest risk for wildfire is wind and heat. Well, our summers are hotter. We have a lot of wind on Martha's Vineyard. And as we say, as the fire professionals have said, fire spreads through the crowns. And that's what the white pines have given us. Lots of high crowns that fire can spread through. So, I think that it's important to include managing for fire in this plan. I don't want to wait for the occurrence of large fires that reach our woodlands and spread before we start managing for wildfire in our state forest. I think that would be really unintelligent. And let's see if I had one more comment. Yeah, someone asked, I think it was one of the most recent commenters about sand plains on the island. That person wanted to see how much sand plain we have on the island now, sand plain grassland, and what this would be adding to the quantity. So is it really worthwhile? Is it such a small amount? It's not of value. Well, there was an awful lot more sand plain grassland on this island, and in the past decades, we've lost the great majority of it. It's gone, and it's never coming back because there are buildings on it. That's gone. And bringing back the sand plain grassland, allowing it to just come back, just giving it a place to be. We don't have to make it come back. We just have to remove what's in the way, and it will rebuild itself in that area, is heroic. And it will give our wildlife and our biodiversity a permanent place to live. No one speaks for wildlife. No one speaks for the flora and fauna. Humans are very good. We're very good at speaking up for ourselves and the things we want and the things we like to do in recreation and where we like to live and where we like to shop. But rarely is the wildlife and the natural systems of our homes taken into consideration. Well, I think we should be speaking for them now while we have the opportunity. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Norma.
Thank you.
Thank you. Chief Salino, you had something to add, and then we're going to wind down. And I just want to, if I forget to say it later, we will hot link to the public comment on our website. If anyone's looking for it, we'll have that on the homepage. Chief Salino, go ahead.
You bet. Norma probably did a better job of answering that fire risk in a big picture than I'm going to. I just want to reiterate to folks, and one of the attendees hit the nail on the head with a lot of these decisions are subjective. In many cases, there's no right or wrong answer when it comes to the fire risk and the fire hazard and how we manage it. We have some hard choices there. I do want to remind folks that we know the data and we know the fire history. And, I'll refute what was stated earlier that New England in general has a very rich wildland fire history. My answer to whether the fall of 24 fire event was historic or not is simple. Yes, it was historic in modern times. It's not historic when you go back to 1947, the 1960s, the 1920s, where we saw upwards of 100,000 to 200,000 acres burn in a year in different sections of New England. In 1947, a fire came down off of one of their mountains and took out almost the entire town of Bar Harbor, which formed the Northeast Forest Fire Compact. And so we know it can happen, and we know that history repeats itself. And my explanation of 24 was that was a reminder that history can repeat itself. Now, we're in a tough decision point here with managing that hazard and that risk at Manuel Correllus with those stands. And we know that there's an issue, and that's the difficulty for the professionals, is that we know what the potential is. We know it from modeling, and we know it from working fire on the ground on that landscape for many, many years. And so it's not an easy choice. What I will say is that if you influence it in one direction or another, that you have to be comfortable with your decision, right? And so a great example of subjectivity is that in Paradise, California, when they lost that town a few years back, and they tried to institute some local zoning on managing burnable vegetation and what people can and can't plant and how they harden their homes to fire, there was yet after that disaster resistance to those local zoning laws. And very interesting, just a really interesting case study. And so it may be easy to think that we can harden every home downwind from a southwest wind driven fire at Manuel Correllus, but I don't think that that's possible. So what's the alternative? We know it by science. We know what the conditions of the stands are, and you have a win-win situation when it comes to managing and preserving that unique habitat out there, and managing the hazard, which manages the risk to those folks downwind.
Thank you, Chief. A big thank you to our state partners, our local partners, and the community who stayed deep into the morning on the other side of the afternoon. Before I sign off, Adam, did you want to add anything?
I just want to thank, first of all, the DCR. You guys this is the way the process should work. There was nothing going on. We reached out to you last year and created a task force and sought to work with you on various projects, including the pathway, including getting a house so we can manage it better, resisting fire. We instituted, for people that don't know, this task force, and we didn't pretend at the MVC level to be experts, but we picked people that were, at least for the island. Not everybody, there's different opinions, but Tom Chase has been looking at this forest for a long time. Bob Woodruff his whole adult life. Tim Bolin, Holly Hill, Alex Schaefer, fire chief. Luann Johnson, Matthew Pelican, biodiversity works. Jeremy Hauser, works for the Vineyard Conservation Society, looks at resources and conservation issues. Karen Lombard from the Nature Conservancy, and David Foster. We looked really hard at it. So when people have different opinions, that's what the process is for. I appreciate that. That's what we're trying to do, is to bring all the divergent things in. But we spent a lot of time, and they spent a lot of time looking at these issues, have spent a lot of their professional lives looking at these issues, and so is DCR. And I just want to recognize AJ and your team and the team that looked at this and supports it, because they looked at it, and there can be changes, and we push for public input. We've had a lot of meetings. I personally have been to Selectman's office and stuff. We didn't hear anything
for a long, long time about these issues, and now we are, because we really have good partners at DCR. Finally, I'm not going to go into what I was going to say. Can you just put up those two?
Yeah.
You know, and I've worked all over the place. Whenever you have large natural issues, people have go to the first one where the dam is there. That's the second one. You always have issues. You know, people disagree on science or everything else. This is the Norton Dam. It's interesting because the Norton family lives here, as well as Colchester, Connecticut. And it has a beautiful mill pond. It's a beautiful dam. There was a park there. And people argue, well, this is a beautiful, it's been there for 100 years. And there was an ecosystem in the back of it. But it was not the right ecosystem, and it was not a natural ecosystem. And it took out, you couldn't put salmon and other things, couldn't get upstream. And through the Nature Conservancy and the state of Connecticut, after, you know, a year of putting a plan together, go to the next one, the dam got taken out. And the river was restored, and the ecosystem was restored, and the biodiversity, that's what the river looks like now. These choices are difficult, but I appreciate the fact that DCR is coming to us and working with us. And I look forward to further discussions, and I look forward to all of the issues being fully addressed. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, AJ,
Okay.
and thank you, Paul, again.
Yeah, no, and thank you guys. And I also, just really quick, I know people are packing up, but I want to make sure we reference and thank the delegation. And Eggertown has been very a wonderful host community to DCR. And then Connor and Josh are local folks who are on the island and in the forest every day, trying to make it a great place for everyone. So thank you very much for your time and effort.
All right, Jesse, thanks again. Bob, enjoy the rest of your vacation. Thank you, AJ and Paul.
Thanks, guys.
For now,
I see him, but
yeah,
where is?
it was Calabria, I believe. All right.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you.
Anytime.
You out here frequently or back?
No, we did a burn over on Fisher's Island the other day. So I came up here, worked with Adam yesterday a little bit. We're trying to figure out what we're gonna do as far as that property. Another one, tried burning chips. Not well. That's it. So now we're trying to come up with some